Industry is not too dissimilar from other industries in that, the sort of the trust elements are not its primary objective. The primary objective of these organizations is to build products, sell to consumers and grow.
Someone's bank account, you can actually look at their breadth of gambling behavior. Really involved gamblers, they have accounts with 5 or 6 different websites or merchants.
Technology has helped us build what we call in-play sports betting opportunities. So now the vast majority of all sports bets are placed during the course of the game. Very few.
Level of AI literacy amongst all stakeholders in our industry is quite varied. I think, there's a lot of probably machine learning, data science experts within gambling operators that are well versed on the topic.
Regulate. So the one thing that I would do to encourage the more openness and transparency is to force disclosure of the industry so that...
Welcome to the Regulating AI Podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI Podcast, your window into the future of AI governance. I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, and today we are exploring a fascinating intersection, AI regulation in the gambling industry, a sector that's really becoming an important testing ground for AI ethics, consumer protection, regulatory frameworks, privacy, and a whole lot more. And today we are joined by 2 pioneers in this space, Simo Dragicevic, co-founder of the Game Safety Institute and the member of the UK Gambling Commission's Digital Advisory Panel. His journey from founding BetBuddy, which was acquired by Playtech, to his current work on AI ethics and product safety gives him unique insights into both industry, innovation, and regulation. With him is also Dr. Kasra Ghaharian, Director of Research at UNLV's International Gaming Institute, where he leads groundbreaking work on AI applications and responsible gambling and payment systems analytics. Together, they'll help us understand how one highly regulated industry is navigating the challenges of AI governance and what lessons we can apply much more broadly. Simo and Cass, welcome to the Regulating AI Podcast.
Hey, Sanjay, good to be here.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So we get 2 for the price of 1 for our audience. So I'm really, really excited. So before we go into this, Simo and Cass, we have a global audience. We have, policymakers, members of Congress, Senate, European members of Parliament. We also have think tanks, AI experts, as well as entrepreneurs who are building AI companies. So for their knowledge, Simo, can you just tell them what led you to launch the Game Safety Institute and what unique challenges do you aim to address there?
Thanks, Sanjay. So, the Game Safety Institute, or GSI, was something I founded just over a year ago. So I've been working in the gambling industry for nearly 15 years. And I guess it's the second time around for me as an entrepreneur. You mentioned I founded BetBuddy, which was an AI platform focused on consumer protection, which was acquired by Playtech. And after serving a few years at Playtech and taking some time out, GSI, or Game Safety, was one area that I was very interested in. And primarily because the regulatory optics have largely been on the player or the consumer in the last 10 or so years. And I see that shift more to the product. And it's an area that I'm, very interested in and see potential in the future. So that's it in a nutshell.
Oh, that's we're going to go much deeper into some of these issues. Cass, you have an academic background. How has that background shaped your approach to using AI for player protection? Just briefly, if you can tell our audience before we get into a lot more deeper things.
Yeah. No, thanks, Sanjay. I was actually working in industry for the most part of 2010 through to 2017, mainly on like marketing analytics, data analytics, but became, you know, I wanted to do something that kind of gave back, something I felt that was really contributing to the betterment of society. So yeah, went back to university to do my PhD, where I focused on leveraging data science and machine learning for consumer protection in the gambling space. So really my interest really got piqued during my PhD, and I've just continued that work now post PhD, moving into AI ethics, AI governance, that kind of thing as well.
Well, we are absolutely glad that both of you are doing the things you are doing, because I have to tell you, I can't turn on the TV without watching FanDuel, BetMGM, and I don't know, there's so many more. But anyway, we'll get into that a little bit more, but it just seems to be, especially during football season, everywhere. Simo, coming to you, you recently noted that 70% of the gambling industry professionals believe the sector must do more regarding AI trust. What specific gaps do you think need addressing, Simo?
Yeah, thanks. I remember that panel where we did the poll with the audience, and actually Kaz was on that panel, and
We did
it's sort of
research on that.
very good research. But interestingly, look, the gambling industry is not too dissimilar from other industries in that, you know, the sort of the trust elements are not its primary objective. You know, the primary objective of these organizations is to build products, sell to consumers, and grow. And all industries have what the economists call negative externalities, and the specific one with gambling is around problem gambling and harm, and that's really sort of become more visible in recent years, and the industry hasn't done itself a lot of favors in the past. And it's really interesting, Sanjay, that you just mentioned the advertising in the US, since specifically online sports betting became regulated across states. We've had the online betting, you know, for a lot longer in the UK and in Europe, and really the problem was that the industry, as I said, didn't do itself any favors, and it kind of saturated the airwaves and the internet with advertising, and this is the problem. It wasn't really aware of what it was doing, and it had a sort of negative impact in terms of the optics of the industry from not just regulators and stakeholders, but consumers as well. So I feel that 70% where the audience didn't feel that it could be trusted comes from past experience where, you know, the industry is probably too focused on short-term growth, and it's not taking a longer-term view. And when it came to this discussion around the use of AI and the impact, there's a concern that it could make similar mistakes again.
So your worry is that, you know, looking at the past, things can obviously be replicated. Also, Simo, you looked at this election, and at least, again, I've been watching elections in the US for a long, long time. Sorry to age myself. This is the first time that we actually had betting on presidential candidates. And obviously, there were stories about how some of it kind of grew into that. Do you have any viewpoint? Because we've just come, at least in the United States, for our listeners who are outside, we've just come out of an election recently, and a lot of money got wagered on that. What are your thoughts on that, Simo?
Yeah,
Well, not on the elections, but just just on the whole point of
that's
betting on elections.
I mean, it's interesting. It's as with other betting markets, you absolutely need some sort of guardrails in place, because, you know, these can be abused. You know, even in sports betting, you know, in the integrity of sports is really important. So being able to not, you know, players, etc., not being able to abuse their position as professional athletes to determine outcomes. And I think sort of there are similar concerns with all types of betting markets. So I personally, I think it's a very interesting market to have. They tend to be more accurate than the formal
exit polls.
Yeah. So, you know, it's a better sense as to where you actually think the election will come out. So I feel as an opportunity to bet. My personal view is as long as the guardrails are in place and that there's protections in place, and maybe the main actors are not or people associated with them are not betting on them because they have party to information that the general public doesn't have, then it could be okay. But I guess there's a little bit of thinking that needs to be done around putting in place the policies and governance to ensure it's fair for punters.
Let me just, if I can, because I'm based in DC, so I'm a little bit of a political junkie. Let's just say I had an interest in one specific candidate. I'm not talking about the presidential, it could be any other election. And I put a lot of money towards that just to make sure that the percentage became higher towards that candidate. It also could give an impression that this candidate is potentially doing much, much better. So could suppress the turnout in other places, etc. I mean, I know that's not your area of expertise. I'm just fascinated about this whole. I mean, any thoughts either of you have on something like that? I mean, because there was somebody who made $80 million out of wagering on this election. I'm sure you read about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It brings a lot of questions, like that example you just gave, Sanjay, about someone with deep pockets putting a lot of money on a market to make it look as though someone's doing better. And then, that's going to have all these different crowd dynamics where people start to follow the crowd. And that's kind of going into how, trading markets work and that kind of thing. We've obviously had betting markets in sport. So I think, I haven't done a deep dive into this myself, but I do know, betting integrity in sports is a huge thing. There's lots of companies now dedicated to making sure sports is fair, and the integrity behind these markets is, quite robust. Now, I'm not aware of how robust those integrity practices are for the betting markets on the elections and other political events. But yeah, maybe there needs to be some inquiry into that. But absolutely, I think the gambling market as it exists today in a lot of regulated markets, integrity is a big thing. So maybe we can take some learnings from that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see. As Simo pointed out, the betting market turned out to be more accurate than the polls, but we can see how it goes.
But as well, like professional athletes can't bet on their own sport, right? So maybe, these people, there should be some people like in DC, for example, that shouldn't be allowed to bet on those markets. Same way that athletes aren't, NFL players can't bet on their NFL games.
That's true.
Yeah.
So as I think Simo said, we need some guardrails. Cass, just coming to you, your research combines payment data with AI for problem gaming detection. Can you explain that to our audience? And how does open banking data revolutionize our understanding of gambling behavior and financial vulnerability? But also, how do you balance privacy concerns with protection needs? I mean, I've asked you like 3 questions in one, but maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about that, Cass.
Yeah. I'll give a brief background before jumping into kind of the banking data and payments data. But, there's been a lot of work over the past few decades now in terms of leveraging consumers' behavioral tracking data, which is kind of an industry term for all of the wagering activity that goes on an online gambling website or even in a land-based casino on a slot machine. All of this data, of course, can be tracked and put into a data warehouse where it can be leveraged for various analytic activities, including marketing activities. But one interesting area has been leveraging that data for consumer protection. So trying to identify patterns and different markers that could indicate whether or not an individual is at risk of experiencing harms from gambling. And I gave a very kind of long explanation there, an individual experiencing at risk, right? We can't say for sure these people have a problem with gambling because, there's no label in the data telling us this person's a problem gambler, this person isn't. We can get part of the way there in terms of, maybe identifying anomalous behavior, or maybe an individual's behavior is deviating from their normal activity. We can also use proxies, things like whether or not someone's self-excluded. A lot of online gambling sites now offer the functionality for someone to self-exclude from a website. So we can use all these things to try and create these models that can detect at-risk behavior. Now, as I was saying, a lot of the time we were using this behavioral data from online websites and slot machines and what have you. We weren't looking more at the other data available. So there's payment services providers that facilitate payments to online gambling websites. That's the data I used for my PhD research. And now more recently, we're looking at how banking data and more specifically open banking data can support this. And the reason why, like the primary reason why anyway, this is really powerful and interesting is that if you look at someone's bank account, you can actually look at their breadth of gambling behavior. You can be a bit more confident that you're capturing all of the gambling activity someone engaged in. Whereas if you do it at a website level, you're only looking at one website. But we know, at least from our preliminary analysis, that the heavily involved gamblers, they have accounts with 5 or 6 different websites or merchants. And the only way you're going to capture all of that activity is if you look at something like a bank statement. So we're looking at that now in terms of how it can support consumer protection. And in terms of the privacy question, just to touch on that, I mean, we have really strong firewalls at the university in terms of all the research we do. We make sure when we are donated data like this, it's, there's no personally identifiable information in that data set. We go through our ethical approval boards. So we have pretty robust procedures in place to protect consumer privacy.
But let's just say, Cass, just to follow on for some of our listeners who are saying, hey, what then, let's say you detect an anomaly or some behavior that's, as you said, is a problem issue. What would you do with that data?
Yeah, Simo could probably answer this better than me because he was in the weeds with this. But, once you've identified a person who might be at risk of harm, there's several different things you could do, maybe turn off marketing activities, or maybe there is a customer intervention protocol that a company has in place. I think some jurisdictions as well are starting to mandate the time period where you have to intervene with this player. I think Dutch regulations recently just said once an operator identifies a person, they have to reach out within, I think it's 1 hour to that person to make sure that, everything's okay, or maybe they can afford to be gambling as much as they are. So there's various different interventions in place. There's a lot of research going on in this area. I don't think we precisely know the best thing to do, but at least we are identifying these people, and we're kind of taking proactive steps in terms of minimizing harm as best we can.
Well, that's good to know that, there is research and there's some tools that can identify it, because, as I said, there's just an unbelievable proliferation of online gambling happening. Simo, you talk about RG Tools 3.0. Can you, for our audience, elaborate on that? And what is its potential impact on the gaming experience?
Yeah, sure. So just to build on what Kaz was saying, when we talk about RG tools, we're talking about things like being able to set a deposit limit. It could be daily, weekly, monthly. It could be the ability to take a time out, to take a break from gambling for a day, a week, a month. It could be a loss limit. So, you want to limit your losses to a certain amount. It could be a timer that tells you how long you've been online. It could be that you self-exclude, that you just remove yourself from gambling. So these are what we call RG tools. And when online gambling really sort of became regulated in the UK, it was around about 2007. These were made available, and that's what I kind of call sort of RG Tools 1.0. So the online industry were very quick to say this is a very responsible industry. In land-based casinos, you can't set deposit limits, loss limits, self-exclude. It's not possible because it's online. It's account-based. We know who the player is. Mm-hmm. We can do all of this. So these were around. The problem was no one really used them. So RG or RG Tools 2.0 has really been about what Kaz was talking about. So leveraging the behavioral data to try and encourage people to uptake them. So the person who looks like they're depositing too much and they've never set a deposit limit, you intervene and you say, have you considered setting a deposit limit? And we did some research that shows, these kind of real-time prompts are much more effective than emails, for example. So I call RG Tools 2.0. It's all about personalization. So how do you take all of the know-how in marketing that's been used for a long time and apply it to consumer protection? How do you get people to use the tools and use them in the right way? And 3.0, I feel it's still a little bit separate. Even the term RG Tools feels like work. Feels like something I still have to go on and switch it on and set it, and it's in a separate part of the website or the app. It still feels a bit disconnected. Whereas I feel the future vision. I really like the auto industry. I feel like they've built some really innovative safety mechanisms in the driving experience. So, when I'm driving a car, my car now, there are some things in there that I find really useful. Lane assist is very useful. Adaptive cruise control, blind spot monitor, collision control. Now, these are good because you can't always be watching the road 100%, especially if you're with someone, you've got the family in the back. So these switched on, I think, are fantastic because they're kind of the eyes and ears of the person. They're looking out for you and they're trying to nudge you in the right place. And I feel that a future gambling industry should sort of take some lessons from that and say, look, how do we build the safety in? How can it think intelligently on behalf of the player instead of the player always having to think about switching this on? What's the right deposit limit? Is $50 a week right, or is $75, or should I take a break, or should I bet on this product? I've never played this before, or should I bet on this market? The future we see this the ability of the operator to more intelligently settle this so it's in the background and it's kind of working more seamlessly and for the player. So that's, I guess, one of the sort of ambitions I'd have to be able to sort of help the industry get to that point.
So what you're saying is it's going to have, like the auto assist and the lane changing. And Simo, isn't there a behavioral science aspect of what this is along with AI? How do you intersect that? I mean, when you look at it, because you're also predicting behavior or monitoring or doing some kind of your behavioral intervention. So have you looked at it from that standpoint, either of you?
I mean, the behavioral science approach is very interesting. The sort of the nudge principles and all of the research into pushing people into the right direction, and I think there's a fair bit that the industry's been, I wouldn't say sort of deploying in a really strong way, but trialing. I'm trying to think of some examples. So, I mean, when we were at Playtech and worked with BetBuddy, the nudge principles were more around, okay, let's look at what behaviors the person has done. So the person's logged in, they've got a moderate risk rating. Okay, let's see what they do in the session. They've deposited £50. They've spent that money and they've redeposited again. We've seen they don't have a deposit limit. So this is where we try and nudge them into sort of setting a sensible deposit limit. So we have tried that kind of approach. And I do feel there's still a lot that can be done there that can help people make those sort of right decisions. So yeah, Sanjay, I think you're right. There's a lot that we could take from that. It's definitely the softly approach, and I think the industry likes it because it's not drastically changing anything, but it's also quite hard to get right and requires a sort of a research, test and learn, data science mindset that a lot of the industry don't always have.
I think another point to this as well is if we take that driving analogy, which I love, the issue in gambling, though, especially with this tool uptake, is a lot of gamblers will say, oh, RG tools, that's not for me. That's only for problem gamblers. There's this that's a real big challenge. That's a real big barrier to get across. And there's a lot of work being done now in terms of messaging and communication. How do we communicate that these RG tools are should be for everyone, and everyone should be using them. So that's a big challenge as well.
So getting acceptability that, hey, it's for everybody. I mean, I think that's a very, very important point that you said. About
Which is
that.
something maybe like the driving analogy, I think a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, this is good. This is for my benefit. I'm not going to get into a car accident. I don't think there's that level of acceptance amongst gamblers straight away to be like, oh yeah, this is going to help me manage my spending and all of this. We need to get there. I think it might be possible, but yeah, we're not there yet. That's a big challenge.
Yeah, no, that's true. Simo, you've written about the need for product safety in gaming. Can you tell our audience what you mean by that, and how does AI change the product safety equation?
Sure. So if we think about sort of products, there's so much available. So what I'm trying to do from a product safety angle is to think about gambling as an entertainment product, and the industry likes to use that term. It doesn't necessarily like to always call it gambling; it's entertainment, and I think that should be our goal. Is it should remain entertainment. The challenge is, though, there are so many gambling opportunities, as you've alluded to earlier, out there. What is the right entertainment product for the right player? And sort of AI adds a sort of an interesting complexity to the mix, because in the past it was pretty the gambling products were quite easy to describe and explain, and there wasn't a lot of variety. If we take sports betting, most of the betting happened before the event. There would be a soccer match, there'd be a football match, hockey game, and you'd bet typically on the outcome of the game. But over the years, it's really evolved, and technology has helped us build what we call in-play sports betting opportunities. So now the vast majority of all sports bets are placed during the course of the game. Very few are sort of pre-event. And then when you think about that, it's just the industry just pushed it further with technology and AI. So now what you have are sort of micro markets and micro bets in sports. So it's not necessarily like who's going to score the next goal, which might require a little bit of knowledge and skill. Now it's like, what's the outcome of the next pitch? And it really, and that's where AI is and technology is sort of generating these markets in a short period of time and pushing them to the consumer to bet on as they're watching the match. And that's something that never really existed, a few years ago. And it's not with sports betting, it tended to be okay, it's a bit of fun. We want to make the game a little bit more exciting, or there's a bit of skill involved, or it's my favorite team. Now it's like every time I'm watching something, there's a market that I can bet on, and we've got to ask ourselves: is the industry creating this because people want to bet on the next pitch and always have that option, or is it another way to make money? So I feel, and the personalization as well also comes in other aspects, just as e-commerce has been personalized for many years. You still have that with gambling as well. So if I'm a slot player, the deposit button might be personalized for what the operator thinks is the kind of optimal deposit that sort of keeps me playing, or the chip size or the coin size could be what they think is the right one for me to sort of extend my play. And so you sort of have this sort of interesting, a lot of the wider stakeholders, regulators, charities, concerned sector are cottoning on and saying, well, hang on a minute, AI is being used to sort of hyper personalize the experience. Is that right for the consumer, and are you taking the consumer's interests into the decision? And arguably they're not. Arguably it's more around, well, how can I generate more opportunities, keep them on device? Not massively dissimilar to social media. That's obviously under a lot of pressure at the moment. So yeah, it's a really interesting interplay of sort of tech and data and AI and gambling, and the industry has really moved on. I mean, Kaz, you were talking about when you worked for Caesars, and that this wasn't really around at the time, was it?
No. Yeah, I like the point as well, like about how diversified the product offerings have got, and there are a lot of exotic products out there, and it is hard to tell sometimes the probabilities of winning. And I think what maybe people are striving for is something similar to, like, say, the alcohol industry. You can buy a bottle of beer or a bottle of liquor, and there'll be the ABV percentage on there. So you kind of know, how much you should be drinking and what the effects are going to be based on that ABV label. If we could get to a stage where we can communicate that simply to someone what the level of risk is with a gambling product, that would be really beneficial, I think. But as Simo can probably speak to, because he's trying to do this right now, it's a little bit more hard to translate that same ABV percentage label to a gambling product, because there's a lot in a gambling in the mechanics of the game that makes it very difficult to communicate simply to a person what they're getting into.
Yeah, so you're saying is some kind of labeling, but for both of you, isn't the gambling industry, they have existing regulatory frameworks? How will AI regulation fit within or challenge these frameworks? As Simo talked about micro targeting, and this is just the beginning. I mean, think about what's coming. Multimodal is coming, digital twins are coming, and I'm saying there are serious gambling implications of that. Think about metaverse and all these things. There will be an explosion. But how is the gaming industry worldwide? Do you believe the existing regulatory frameworks are good enough, or with AI you need some different perspectives?
Yeah, it's a really good point that you just brought up. So we did some preliminary research about 18 months ago now, because we were interested in that question precisely. Like, there were all these AI ethics guidelines being written, these AI governance guidelines being written by, governments and academic institutions, but they were all, very broad. They were speaking to AI very broadly. They weren't necessarily sector specific. I think you started to see some sector specific guidelines for things like finance and insurance, but we weren't seeing any for the gambling industry. So we wanted to look at this. So we conducted some preliminary research. We interviewed about 30 to 40 stakeholders about this, operators, consultants, regulators, and we were asking them, what are the specific ethical issues and concerns, and how should we address these risks? And in terms of the regulation, there are actually two schools of thought on it. A lot of people said that, yes, we need specific AI regulations because the gambling industry is very unique. It is a potentially harmful product, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, we actually had some regulators say, our existing frameworks in regulated jurisdictions are very robust. We have, pillars of regulation, like gambling should be safe, gambling should be fair, it should be crime-free. And perhaps we can fall back on those regulations, and we don't necessarily need existing AI-specific ones. And I think one interviewee put it quite nicely, because he compared it to the advent of online gambling, where, we didn't necessarily see massive regulatory changes. We still had our kind of pillars that we were able to fall back on. And I think over time, as online gambling became more sophisticated, we did start to see more specific regulations coming there as the online gambling market grew and it became more mature. So I think the same thing's probably going to happen with AI. The one thing I worry about with AI is the pace of change. I think the pace of it right now is a lot different to the internet. The internet kind of evolved, over 10, 20 years or whatever. I mean, if you look at AI right now, the pace of change just in like 12 months is absolutely insane. So I do worry about whether that same approach in online gambling is going to work here.
No, that's the pace of change is mind-blowing. And as I said, it's what is coming down the pike is going to be just something to watch for. But I think, Cass, you bring me to another important point is, how do you address potential biases in AI system? Because these online gaming and others are using AI to a certain degree in terms of marketing, targeting, micro-targeting, and those are kind of built into certain pre-existing data. Uh, how how do you address that, or how can regulation address that? Are we targeting the vulnerable population to a large degree that might be susceptible to some of these things?
It could 100% be a risk, I think. And I don't know, at least I'm not aware of anyone broadcasting like transparently their practices around how they're minimizing AI bias or not exploiting vulnerable people with marketing practices. So to that point, I think that is an opportunity maybe for regulators to step in there. This brings me to another point, though. I think the level of AI literacy amongst all stakeholders in our industry is quite varied. I think, there's a lot of probably machine learning, data science experts within gambling operators that are well versed on the topic. However, you present the word algorithmic bias to a regulator, I don't know if 100% of regulators will know exactly what you're talking about there. So that's a huge issue. If we're not AI literate, especially regulators, especially like people working in consumer protection, how are we ever going to, appropriately govern it and put these guardrails in place? So yeah, that's another topic. But in terms of the bias specifically, obviously, there's been a lot of commentary and discourse in terms of race and ethnicity and all those kind of things. I think in gambling, what's interesting is the ability perhaps for AI algorithms to inadvertently model problem gambling. Because you're feeding this data into a marketing algorithm that is supposed to optimize engagement. Mm-hmm. You could envision an algorithm, creating a persona of someone that is, highly engaged, but also a problem gambler. But the algorithm doesn't know how to differentiate between those two things. So I think like layering on kind of these evaluation or checks, if you will, like, you could envision checking an algorithm, whether it is exploiting vulnerable people by like maybe crafting some kind of benchmark data set or that kind of thing. I think that's somewhere we could go. But I think first we need to address the literacy piece. I think that's a little bit more important at this stage.
So literacy of regulators. But Simo, you said UK and other places have had this since 2007. We are obviously, US is new to this thing. Has anything like this been looked at, whether intended or unintended biases that have crept in? I mean, because AI is doing micro-targeting based on data it is collecting, data from the internet, from other places, etc. Has anything like that been discussed globally at all, in your view?
Probably not. It is quite a sort of a complex, sort of technical task to unpick the potential bias in an algorithm, and requires some time and skill to be able to do that. And I've worked on specific side projects with colleagues to try and understand bias. I'm probably one of the few people who've spent over a decade working in this domain, and it wasn't a core part of what I did. So if it wasn't a core part of what I did, it's probably unlikely to be a core part of what someone else is doing and what a regulator's doing. So for sure, there's an awareness that it could exist, and it's mainly those sort of broader cases, around sort of race and ethnicity that kind of become sort of more publicly aware. But I feel there's an awareness that there could be bias, but no one really knows how to tackle it. No one knows where to start, and I think it touches upon what Kaz was saying. Regulators are aware they need to know more about how the industry is using data and technology, but they're beginning to make sort of strides forward to try and address that, especially in the UK. The UK regulators probably, I think it's fair to say, is considered one of the most progressive and experienced, advanced regulators in the world, because it's been regulating online for so long. And, they are making some sort of specific commitments and strategic directions to become much more digital and much more proactive. But regulators, it takes time. This is regulators move at a much slower pace. There's a lot of reasons for that. It takes a long time to put regulations in place. Then they typically stay there for a while. The typical person who becomes a regulator is a career civil servant, or somebody who's maybe been in the police force, or a lawyer. So they're not used to working in sort of high-tech industries and adapting at fast scale. So there's a lot of challenges for regulators, but I can see they're beginning to make some specific efforts to try and address those. It's going to take a little while for us to see the outputs of that.
But do you see this as a small problem, a big problem, or something? As you know, we have a lot of members of Congress, European members of Parliament on our show, etc. Is this something that needs to be brought up to some of these people, or you think in the midst of 10 big things, it's not really that gets up to that big attention?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a little bit like Kaz was saying, the regulators probably focus on these pillars or these strategic objectives. The three you mentioned was keep players safe, keep crime out of gambling, keep gambling fair. And how they achieve the objective probably is more important than, if they feel that they're winning that battle, they're not too concerned about sort of what's happening below. But they're also aware of the pace of change and the innovation, and it kind of worries them a little bit, because this is all happening and they need to realize they need to try and keep on top of it. And they may not ever be able to understand all of it, but they're going to need to be able to appreciate what's happening, ask the right questions, and know where to get information and how to dig deeper, because otherwise there will be an industry that they won't understand and will be very difficult to regulate, and will have shifted so much. What skills and knowledge they had to regulate the last 10 years will be sort of less relevant going forward. So they're definitely cognizant of it. I was at the International Association of Gaming Regulators, which is the annual get-together of all gambling regulators conference about a month ago. And the main topic was AI, and I was moderating a panel on regulation and AI. So it's definitely there. I wouldn't say it's a burning platform issue, but it's there it's definitely in the top 10. I wouldn't say, hard to know what number it is at the moment.
Just one last point I'll add, and you guys are experts. I'm just thinking that unlike physical, like gambling or gaming operations, where you can't discriminate or encourage based on your background or your propensity. Here, if you did that, it's hard for people to know how you're doing micro-targeting. But anyway, that's just maybe, as you said, it's not a topic. But both of you have brought up something which is very important, and that's something, Regulating AI as an organization does. You talked about, the education for regulators. So how do you ensure that AI systems remain explainable to regulators and users? And how do we make sure these regulators can keep pace with this rapid technological change? What would be your message to us, but to the people who are listening? There are members of Congress who do the regulations. What do you suggest for them?
One big message I think I'm trying to just personally send, when I speak on a panel or on a podcast like this, I think in terms of stakeholders in the gambling sector, I think it would be a really good idea at this stage to have that AI champion in your organization, or maybe it's a board of people or something. And that's if you're a regulator, a non-profit, an operator. I think we're at the stage now where there definitely needs to be at least one person, or maybe it's like a little internal team of people who spend some time looking at this. And then, they're actually dedicating some time and resources to understanding what's going on, and really spearheading it from internally, from an organizational perspective. So that's actually the big message I'm sending out. I think that's kind of like a more foundational aspect of all of this. That is something that would lead to a lot of other benefits, I think. So that's what I'm trying to push for, at least.
So that's a good point. That brings me to just a question to follow up. Most large companies or mid-sized companies have now set up AI ethics boards, to make sure that it's following an ethical principle, as you talked about privacy, transparency, explainability, etc. Do you think these, whether it's this online gaming institutes, etc., should have something like that also?
I mean, an ethical approval board is something very familiar to me as an academic. Whenever I do a research project, I have to submit approval for it to my institutional review board. They look at the methods, make sure people's privacy is protected, or if there's sensitive data being collected, etc., etc. I absolutely think it's a great idea to have that internally in terms of a self-governing mechanism. You could also envision it happening externally with like third-party audits or that kind of thing. I do know like Google or I think it was Meta tried this out, but it seemed to didn't really work a few years ago. I don't know, maybe it was at an early stage or something, but I mean, I just see it as a.
But most big companies now have AI ethics boards that because I talked to a lot of them and they all have internal AI ethics boards. And the other thing you said is the regulator should have a point person for AI, because I think those are two good points that hopefully we can pass on to these people. But you brought up, and I will ask both of you, what role can certification, mandatory testing and certification play? Is there a role for that?
I think so. Just a tiny build on the last question. If I was a regulator, the one thing that I would do to encourage the more openness and transparency is to force disclosure of the industry, so that they're forced to disclose more about their processes, what they developed, how they developed it, especially if they're relying on it for safety. If they're relying on an algorithm to detect risky patterns, they should, even if the regulator, and I wholeheartedly agree with the suggestion that there should be somebody, a senior champion, not an analyst who, but there's somebody on the executive who's responsible for this, that even if they were just to enforce this more open disclosure, all of a sudden it opens up opportunities to understand and question and critique. And that transparency and openness, I think, is really is a sign of, I think, a mature industry. We see it in financial services in not the same use cases, but, where risk management plays a huge part. Organizations have to disclose the models and the data, which stress tested them, and the outputs. Otherwise, then they're going to have more, restrictive capital requirements. So likewise, in the gambling industry, I think a regulator should be confident enough to be able to ask for that disclosure. It doesn't mean you have to use the information from day one. It may take you a while to get up to speed, but at least you have it and you can then move forward. And sorry, Sanjay, what was the question? Because I've just forgotten that question.
No.
I wanted to get that one off my chest.
No. My point was, is there a role for mandatory testing and certification here, especially relating to AI, Simo? I mean, because Cass brought that up a little bit.
Yeah, no, and just building on that, I do believe the sort of the mandatory disclosure and the certification, the idea that Kaz talks about the benchmarking. I mean, how do you know how good an internal algorithm is or a third-party system is unless you test it on the same data set, to predict, to classify the same outcome. So if there was an independent organization that had that data where you could submit and you could test your solutions against, I think that would, again, it would just open up. You all of a sudden you would see the KPIs, you would see the metrics. Well, FanDuel and DraftKings have used this sort of testing or benchmarking service, and their internal algorithms are 70% accurate. Well, I know that now. So, that's actually really useful information, because when you test it again next year, I expect it to be better. Or, if you say to me, well, I don't need to switch off marketing because my AI is so good, I'll know that, well, that's not true because it's good, but it could be better. There's still a proportion of your population that are being missed. And is that due to bias, as you said earlier, Sanjay? How can we do that? So that doesn't exist today. So I feel there's an opportunity to really raise standards and do that.
Go ahead.
I agree with everything Simo just said there. And moving back to the prior question again, I think Simo made a really good point though in terms of regulators enforcing transparency among operators. I think another key aspect of that is if we look at something like the EU AI Act, because the EU AI Act, while it's very broad, it kind of operates in this kind of sector-specific framework where it's giving kind of the broad framework, and then it's going to work with sector-specific regulators in terms of enforcing that. So sooner rather than later, this EU AI board or whatever it is going to come to probably gambling regulators and be like, how is AI being used in your industry? Mm-hmm. And currently, I don't think they'd be able to give a good answer to this EU AI board. Whereas, if we did say to regulators, start enforcing transparency, every company should have an AI registry of their AI use cases and things, at least then they'd know how AI is being used. And then they can kind of, correspond that with the EU AI like risk framework. And we can then start to understand, okay, these use cases fall in this risk category, these ones fall out of it. So I think that's another key point about transparency there.
Well, that's a very important point. I should have asked this question up front for our audience, but just to both of you, when you look at, you mentioned FanDuel, DraftKings, and others, are these online gaming organizations also regulated by like the Gaming Commission and others? Is it the same, or is there a different body that does it for them? In the US and outside, just for our audience, if you can tell them a little bit.
Yeah, it's typically by jurisdiction. Okay. It gets a little bit more complicated in somewhere like the US, which has obviously a very patchwork state-by-state regulatory regime, and also there's no federal oversight of gambling in the US.
Yeah,
it's all state-by-state regulation. So in terms of like a FanDuel, they would need to get a gambling license through each state they want to operate in. And then similarly in Europe, you would need to be legislated with whichever jurisdiction you're trying to operate in. Simo's. I am, but
it's complicated. There was a lot of effort, I think, in Europe over the years to try and harmonize gambling regulations, but it never really happened. And the industry always complains, and they have some justification that why can't you just follow the best practice of this state or this jurisdiction so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But that's the way it is. Governments and provinces and states like to make their own decisions on tax and revenue, and and it's complicated. The US, it's some products are regulated, some are not. There's a lot of
tribal gaming as well.
Tribal gaming, land-based is a very powerful lobby. So yeah, it is actually a really big and complex overhead for the industry to try and navigate all of that. It's fair to say to them,
So it's complicated. Just last question before we get into some fun stuff is, there is some new things that are on their way, like esports and others. Do you see them having, new things that come up that would have an impact on this whole gaming and AI and regulations at all?
I can provide two answers to this. One is, I think it's going to have an impact. And then my second part of my answer is, you should have my boss on the show, who's Dr. Bretta Barbanel, because this is her specific research area, is the intersection of esports and gambling. So she would be able to answer that question really well. But absolutely, I think, you can see that sector growing. There's a lot of focus on integrity because, fixing games in that area is a big concern right now. And you can see AI exacerbating all of that. So yeah, in brief, but you should have my boss on the show.
We'll definitely do that, because is it like esports now going to be part of the Olympics or something like that? They're becoming mainstream, so to speak. So A lot going on, I mean, in your sector, which good for you. You're going to have a busy time for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So I'm really happy to hear that. So now we move to a little more of the fun side. Well, this has been fun for me. I've learned a heck of a lot, which is basically a lightning round. You're in the gaming industry, so you know, just one word answer. So I'll try to pick between the two of you. So let's just see what we can come up with. So, Simo, innovation or regulation?
Innovation.
Okay, Cass, AI is an opportunity or a threat?
Opportunity.
Simo, ethics or performance? That's a tough one, right?
Performance.
Performance, okay.
Simo's struggling to have his startup founder hat on or his regulated gambling commission.
Yeah.
That's been pulled
Yeah.
apart.
Pulled apart. Okay, guys. Open source or proprietary?
Open source. Easy.
Okay. So for both of you, is current AI regulation sufficient for the gaming industry?
I don't think so. I think more needs to be done, as we've discussed. Yeah.
Cass?
Yeah, I'd agree with that for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Finally, both of you, what is the biggest AI risk in gambling? Simo?
Biggest AI risk in gambling.
Or gaming?
I think it's the industry not being open to what will come if it just continues to innovate at super fast pace. I know I just said performance over regulation because I had to pick one, but if you just think about performance, then the problem is the one size fits all regulation just will come in, and it will limit the industry. And then we need another podcast to talk about the whole impacts of illegal gambling and other sectors. You drive your customers into somewhere which you can't regulate. So I think it's just being head in the sand, focused, not being proactive enough to think about the future.
Cass, your answer, but it has to be different than his.
Yeah,
Can't borrow from him.
I'm going to say that the biggest risk is not AI, it's ourselves. Because I think we, as the gambling sector, need to do a better job of, to my point, getting more literate in this area. And, if we're not going to get to a higher level of AI literacy, I think then all of the AI risks are going to be really big risks. But if we get our literacy level up, then we can start to mitigate those risks. So kind of a workaround to your question, but
well, that's good. We are the biggest risk to this industry. Okay, Simo, we'll start with you. Final words to our listeners, members of Congress, regulators, etc. What would be one actionable thing that you want to leave them behind for? Briefly,
I would take ownership of this, as leaders in your organizations, take ownership and push for disclosure. Don't be afraid to push for disclosure and ask for more transparency. It will start the ball rolling, and the right things will come off the back of that.
Push for disclosure. Transparency is a big word you've been using, Simo, all along. So we'll key in on that. Cass, one final actionable item for our listeners.
Yeah, for those in the gambling industry, but more for those outside of the gambling industry, let's look at the gambling industry about this topic, AI ethics, AI governance, because I think there's a real opportunity here to look at a vice product, a controversial product, but one that has a huge mass of data about the way people engage in this activity. I don't think there's another product like this, like a vice product or controversial product, that has this level of granular data, of behavioral data about it. So I think there's an opportunity here for the gambling sector to put its best foot forward and demonstrate how to regulate itself and AI here.
Put its best foot forward for our listeners. That's an important message. And to our listeners, today's conversation with Simo and Cass really has illuminated how one highly regulated industry is tackling, or I would say trying to tackle, the challenges of AI governance and their insights on balancing innovation with protection, the importance of data-driven approaches, and also the need for collaborative solutions really offers a valuable lessons for anyone involved in AI regulations. I've learned a heck of a lot today, and thank you to both for sharing your expertise, and really fairly enjoyable. Next time I'm in Vegas, I'll be thinking of you. And thank you to our listeners for joining me, Sanjay Puri, on the Regulating AI podcast. Remember to subscribe for more conversations shaping the future of AI governance. And until next time, keep innovating responsibly. Thank you, Kas. Thank you, Simo. This was fantastic. Really appreciate it.